back to your point about high-performing teams, and back to the Lencioni pyramid around accountability, that we had the commitment, now you're able to drive accountability.
And that exactly, and that's the last piece that sits between commitment and the top of the pyramid, which is results. It's the notion of joint accountability. But what Lencioni very cleverly throws in as an additional word in that tier is joint accountability and ownership. You own the decisions. You own them jointly and severally. And you're able to do that because you've made a commitment, not reached a consensus.
Yeah.
And it's that stage that allows you then to circle back, right? When you think things aren't happening in the right way, when you feel there isn't joint accountability and ownership, we come back down the pyramid. We need to have a conversation.
Yeah.
We need to have a conversation about that. If I don't feel that's happening in this team, I have an obligation to raise a conversation within the team about that. Yeah. And I can do that, and it can be received by the team because we have trust. This is not me having a go at you, Rohit, right? This is not me criticizing you per se. This is not me trying to politically position myself as being a better team member than you. It would be, or it could be perceived as that if we didn't have trust. But because we've got trust, I'm able to do that. And the rest of the team is able to receive that, safe in the knowledge that my intention is because I want the best for the team, not because I'm trying to position myself. And you then start to see the fluidity of this pyramid in practice. Why each component, and the deeper you go in the pyramid, the more, I may put it this way, the more important the component is, because it's that releases the rest of the pyramid, which moves us towards our high performance.
Yeah, I think the one thing that, I'll, on behalf of those listening, the question that comes up is when you talk about ownership, right? Owning the decision, there are some decisions that are the right and privilege and responsibility of the person at the top of the food chain. And often and I think about smaller businesses where, you've got the CEO who is a founder and owns the entirety of the business, right? They have all the decision rights. They've always had the decision rights. And so the team members that they have brought on over the years, and the business is doing really well and all of that stuff, but the team members that they've brought on, they would also say, hey, look, I trust the person. I trust what they do. I can tell him or her that they've got these issues, so I can sort of somehow justify my way to this level of the pyramid. But I'm not responsible for the decisions because it's not my decision to make. I never have been given the privilege to make such a decision. I'd love to, but I don't. And I think, is that something common that you have heard as well from people, obviously not at the top of the pyramid in terms of the organizational stack, but people in middle management saying, hey, I'd love to agree with you, David, but what if I'm not allowed to make a decision? How can I feel ownership? And is that by design, given our discussion on Lencioni, then tell that person and the organization that there is lack of trust in the system, and therefore we can never be a high performing team?
Yeah. So it depends. I think my answer will depend on, as you described, that person. It depends where that person sits, right, within the organization. So if that person is part of this team that we're describing, then they absolutely should be involved in the decision-making process, right? That doesn't mean that I'm necessarily a decision maker, but I can be involved in the decision-making process. This is fundamentally important, and it becomes even more important when you reach out beyond that senior team. There'll be some things that the CEO decides. There'll be some things that the CEO, in combination with investors, decides. There'll be some things that the top team as a whole decides. Okay, but it's highly likely that people outside of that team won't be the decision makers at all. But
that's a good.
But Rohit, here's the important point: they are the enactors of those decisions.
Yeah.
You need those people as an organization to enact those decisions in order to produce business performance. So the question for a CEO, for a senior team, how do we engage people?
Yeah.
They might not be decision makers. Is there a possibility of us engaging them in the decision-making process? Sometimes yes. Okay. Are we doing it? Sometimes no.
Yeah.
So how do we engage? But we're now reaching out beyond the team. We're talking about the organizational team within which sits the senior team, the top team, the executive team, however you define it in your own organization. But being engaged in the decision-making process, which is different to being a decision maker, is really important because you're seeking the feeling of ownership. Because when I own something, I'm going to enact it. If I don't feel ownership over something, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, and I think we'll come to that in the leadership episode as well, because one of the common questions that I engage with CEOs on is that how do I translate my decisions and that of my executive team to the production floor, for example, right? Because they're obviously not going to be involved in the decision making or the process, but they need to understand the decision and why that decision is. And I think so often my conversation is like, it's a translation element. You've got to be able to translate it in a way that is received and understood, because one is you have to your point, have that connective tissue. And so the question that you're asking is that, do you have that connective tissue, those mechanisms, those opportunities? And then two is, once you do, how are you communicating, right? And so we'll discuss more of that in the leadership episode, because it is a fundamental point around and the struggle for a lot of CEOs saying, hey, look, I'd love to have a lot of people in the room, but first of all, I've got to make the decisions because there is an expediency element to it. I think what you're coaching is decision-making can be quick, but if people are not bought in, if there is no commitment, the execution implementation will be very slow, if at all. And so what's the point in making a very quick decision if nobody is bought into it?
So you've kind of wasted one of my key phrases on the subject of leadership, and I know we'll come to this on a future episode, but it reminds me of it here. One of my key phrases on leadership is, it's hard to lead if nobody is following.
That's true.
And it speaks to exactly what you've just described. Yes, the leader or the leadership team will very often make the decision. The decision can be very quick. How you translate that decision into your organization is fundamental in terms of whether you are getting followership. And if you're not getting followership, you can make the greatest decisions in the world. But if they're not being enacted, they're useless.
Absolutely. And I think I won't distract us down that path anymore because I've done enough of that in this conversation. But I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. And I think the thing that I come back to is what you were highlighting before, which was the roles people play on teams, right? So now that you've got, you touched on it very briefly, that you've got the pyramid, let's say everyone listening say, okay, I can make my way through it, or I can do things differently. But I think what you were highlighting there before, David, was that just because someone is somewhere else in an organizational stack, just because they don't have the title, doesn't mean that they can't be part of the process or they can't play a pivotal role in helping the team make and live and execute those decisions. Is that a fair way of summarizing what you were trying to get at earlier?
Yeah, I think, there are, alongside the categories that we've described, that are released, as Lancioni describes it, off the basis of trust. There are certain roles, there are certain behavioral roles, behavioral contributions that we also know exist in all high-performing teams. And they don't just exist, but they are valued. Many teams will have some of these behavioral roles. Some teams will have all of them, but it's only when those roles are recognized and valued, as well as being present, that a team has the chance to be high-performing. This comes from work that was done by a gentleman called David Cantor. Cantor was a systems dynamicist. Okay. And a team is a system, right? A team is a system. So amongst many other areas, this was one of the areas that he focused on. and his work is it's actually quite fascinating. And I have a lot of fun actually with teams that I work with when we talk about these roles. The smiles and the nods and the glances across the room are quite palpable when they hear these different roles described. Because again, a bit like Lancioni, once you give people the language around this, they kind of intuitively know that this stuff goes on, or is present, or is missing, or is valued, or is not valued, or people get acknowledged for some things and kind of get the mickey taken out of them for others. They kind of know all that stuff goes on, but they haven't got the language to put around it to figure out why it matters. And Cantor's work in this area is really quite nice to be able to do.
So what are those roles?
So the 4 roles are in a team. So he labels them in a certain way. I can give you the labels, but if I explain the roles, he says that in a team you need the people that are fundamentally what we might call the idea generators, right? The people that get excited about coming up with ideas, and in fact, as soon as other people in the team get engaged in those ideas, the idea generator is already fed up with it and wants to come up with the next idea. So they tend to be the first people that speak. They tend to be the loudest people. They tend to be the people that occupy the most airtime, right? But they're important because they're the idea generators. Then you get another category of people who are, what they're fundamentally doing is they're testing to destruction the ideas that are being generated by the other category of people, right? So these tend to be people that lead with questions rather than lead with answers, but they're seeking answers. This is the key. But in order to test something, you ask questions. So you've got the idea generator who's coming up with all these, what they think are wacky and wonderful and crazy and fantastic ideas. And they're coming up against this other group of people that are at the very earliest opportunity questioning those ideas. But the team needs that because you want to make sure as a team, you're only taking forward the very best ideas.
Yep.
You need to test them in order to establish that. So you've got a group of idea generators in a team. You need them. That's where your ideas are coming from. You've got a group of people who are testing those ideas. You need them because you want to make sure only the best thought through ideas are taken forward.
Yep.
You've got all that going on in an immediate dynamic. So what you also need is people within the team who can bring a broader perspective, who can bring some thinking that is outside the immediacy of that conversation, who can bring different ways of thinking, who can bring past examples, who can bring different contexts into that very dynamic conversation that's happening between the idea generator and the thought tester. You need that external, that perspective being brought into the room. Fundamental group of people. Now, at this stage, you've got ideas, you've got the testing of ideas, you've got perspective, but you've not actually got any. So what a team also needs is people that can get stuff done.
Yep.
Get stuff done. And it's this combination of these 4 fundamentals that not just need to be present in a team, but need to be valued in a team.
Yeah.
Your perspective bringer might only say 1 or 2 things in an entire meeting, but what they say changes the direction of conversation or takes it to a much deeper level.
Yeah.
But they tend to be the quietest people in the room, right? And so what many teams do is they dismiss these people, right? They dismiss them because they see them as the quiet person in the corner who hardly ever speaks. They don't really contribute much.
For that value, yeah.
Once you start to understand the behavioral roles, the purpose isn't to be bouncing off the walls. The purpose isn't to be rah-rah-rahing it through a meeting. The purpose is to be thoughtful, to be reflective, to bring that perspective and to deliver that one killer contribution. That's their role. That's their behavioral role within the team.
Yeah.
And teams at their peril dismiss these people, right? That second category of people, that idea tester, can get a bad reputation in a team. Oh my God, there goes Rohit again. we're coming up with all these great ideas, and all he ever does, oh my God, he's full of doom and gloom. All he ever does is question things. Why can't he just go along with a really great idea? He's always bringing us down. That's his role within the team. He's not doing it to poo-poo an idea. He's doing it to make sure to pressure test that idea is robust, it's thought through, it's bomb-proof, it's the right one to take forward. Now, the link back to Lencioni. If I understand that that's his behavioral contribution to this team, then I trust his intention, right, is to pressure test ideas, not to be the doom and gloom merchant in the team. If trust is in place, then the power of that role can flourish. So you start to see now the behavioral roles, the way that Cantor thinks about it, and the way that Lencioni thinks about it are fundamentally connected. And that gives you the identikit that you need to be high performing. You need the pyramid elements, but you need the behavioral roles also.
Yeah, that's exactly what as you were saying that, I was thinking that you need the trust and the ability to have that conflict and work through it. And then by having these behavioral roles that you're describing, when that conflict arises, because there's trust, these roles are not considered to be anti anything. They're understood and, as you said, valued. And so because the intention is clear, right? And then with that clarity of intention, like, okay, you've got the best interest. And I often, this has been all through my career, I've always sort of said, whenever I've gotten into a sticky situation, I always sort of go back to what's the right thing for the company, because then it sort of takes me away, and that clarifies my intention for everyone in the room who may misunderstand it, right? In fact, clarifies it for myself. And so why I bring that up is that intention piece that we sort of, I know we brushed past it, but it is a key to that connective tissue being built. But one question I had for you regarding these behaviors is, I was smiling while you were saying it because I can think of certain types, and not to put people in boxes or titles, but certain types of functions or people who would suit certain roles more than others would. And so, two-part question, do these roles, do people naturally self-select into these roles? Or is it the job of the team leader in a high-performing team, or with the ambition to build a high-performing team, to identify those who would play these roles? So how does that actually happen in real life?
Yeah, it can be a bit of a mismatch, right? So we all have our default. We all have our behavioral default. And we usually show up in two of the four roles. One very predominantly, and one as a secondary, and then we're usually not the other two. That's just human behavior, right?
Yeah.
So it can very often be that teams have all four roles present, and thus the blocker to moving to high performance is not that they don't have the roles naturally present, it's that they don't value them, and therefore the full power of all four roles isn't being played out. So that can very often be one scenario. But another scenario is, let's say as a CEO, you've recruited your top talent team, right? And that's been based on their experience, their skill, their ability in their, if I can put it this way, their departmental positions, right? And from that, they will have a certain set of default behavioral role contributions in the way that we're describing. And it may well be that some roles are underplayed. That doesn't mean that you need to get rid of somebody and recruit somebody else into the team.
Yeah.
But it means that with that awareness, you have to figure out, how do we boost more of the role that we may be lacking in? We've got lots of idea generators, but we've not got enough people that are able to test those ideas to destruction.
Yeah.
But we've got a few people who play that role secondarily. It's not their default role, but they've got the ability to do it. Right. As a leader, how do I encourage that? How do I empower that? How do I build their skill in that? How do I build their confidence to speak out and to deploy that skill? So it's not about having to change the team because the behavioral role is not there. The capability for the behavioral role will be there. I guarantee you,
Yeah.
it will be there. It might need some nurturing.
I would almost, if I may add one more thing, I think to your point, it's tied to what you were saying, which is, having the awareness of who has which role implicitly to their strengths, that who can play, but may or may not be exhibiting those. But the other part of that is also who are preventing, the other people from speaking. So one thing I can imagine is the idea generation folks may, given that they will take the most airtime and are obviously passionate about their ideas, may also be the people who have strong opinions. And therefore, for example, and it's a hypothetical, but I can imagine, I'm thinking of a few people who may stifle the ones who are more around that sort of broader perspective, or the quieter ones who are reflecting on the conversation and trying to get in at the right time. And so part of the leadership, again, we'll talk more about this in the how to be a great leader episode, but part of it's also sort of understanding, I think, what you're saying, and allowing, as much as it is to allow people or to encourage people to speak, is also to manage those who may be speaking and are not allowing that to happen. So it's this managing the dynamic, which is why I guess leadership is a privilege, and you've got to earn it in the room.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I often think in that scenario, the analogy that I find useful is, at that moment, as the leader, I am the conductor and my team is the orchestra. And if my violins are being drowned out by my brass section, what am I going to do about that? Correct. Right? I may need to do one of or both of. I may need to just quieten the brass section a little bit, right? Or I may need to have the violins play a little bit louder, or I might need to do both. But as a leader, that's one of the things that I need to be aware of. I need to be purposefully conscious about that. Are my perspective bringers being heard? I may need to coach them to have more confidence to speak up, to break into the conversation. I may need to coach my idea generators. I don't want to lose the power of what they bring, but I need them to help me create space for my perspective bringers, for example.
Yeah, and the last thing I would say on this, David, is that I've actually gone through, like, I was reflecting on myself, and I've never been the ideas generation person, but across the other three, I've played a role. And I think as people go through their career, they may start at one place and end up at a different place, partly because of the exposure they've had or what they enjoy, you know. And so I can imagine a lot of consultants listening into this conversation, or former consultants, may identify themselves as those who are questioning the ideas and checking the validity and looking at the data and really filtering it out. Whereas a lot of operators might be the ones saying, hey, look, I'm the get it done person, right? And I know how to get it done. That said, the get it done person may change in a few years to be the perspective person, because they've had it done so many times. They're like, I can see this movie play out, and let me wait for everyone to finish their thoughts, and I can just say, hey, but what about this? So there is an evolution also within the humans to kind of change, and that's also part of the leader to say, hey, look, who's playing what role now, and would that change over time? Especially going back to the beginning of our conversation, we're solving for that long-term, high-performing leadership team that continues to thrive. And so that's really it. Subscribe to the People Quotient channel, where leadership meets action. Powerful conversations with practical insights that you can use right now. See you in the next episode.